Hello and welcome wherever in the world you are joining us from today. For me, it is good morning, and I'm not sure whether it might be good afternoon or good evening for any of the others of you who are joining us today. We're going to give it just a few minutes to let our participants come on in and settle down, and then we will get started. Welcome, everyone. We're just giving it a few minutes to have all our participants log on before we get started. So come on in.
Good morning. Or good afternoon. Or good evening.
Hello and welcome everyone to the WMFDP FDP Global webinar, part of our Unscripted series. Today's conversation is on class and caste. And as usual, here we are discussing undiscussables. And excited that you're joining us to do so.
Good morning.
Maybe let's give it another couple of minutes. Noah, do you think?
Absolutely. I'm ready I will follow your lead and I am ready to go.
Okay, the numbers coming in are slowing down a little bit, although I know we're still off from the folks who have registered. But we do have limited time and I want us to not miss the opportunity to hear from our panelists and get questions from our audience. So we'll do just one more minute and then we will get started. Oh, okay, I see a message from one of our colleagues saying that it's looking like we're pretty close to registration, so we might as well get started. Right. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WMFDP FDP Global webinar in our Unscripted series. And today's topic is class and caste, the Undiscussables. I am really excited that you've joined us for this. My name is Amalia Alarcón Morris, and I am a senior associate with WMFDP FDP Global. And I am based in the Republic of Panama. So that's where I am zooming in from today, from lovely Central America. And I am going to turn it over to my colleague Noah, who I have the joy of co-facilitating with him today and participating in this with him today so that he can introduce himself and then we can jump into the meat of the matter.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Amalia. Good morning from my neck of the woods, Seattle, Washington. Good afternoon, good evening if you are in a different time zone. Really pleased to be here with Amalia and our esteemed panelists today with FDP Global hosting this undiscussable conversation. I've really been thinking about this with the other panelists for the past week and excited of where we can go today. This conversation on class and caste is interesting though, Amalia. We've both been with this group for a long time. We've done this work for a long time in the corporate and private sector. And the idea still, even in DEI, of talking about things like a caste system and thinking, is there any remnant of caste in the society that I live in? Or thinking about talking about class and money and how that intersects with the ways I show up in the work world. it still beats in my heart a little bit to begin having this conversation. So I'm just noticing that about how I'm entering it. How are you feeling?
I'm excited about it because I find that it is underlying so much of what we do and we don't name it. For me, as a Latin American, I hear all the time, for me, my interest, of course, is the intersection between class and caste and race.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear a lot from my fellow Latin Americans, we're not racist, we're classist, but we're not racist. Like that somehow absolves us of something. And yet, if you look at the demographics of at least where I live in Panama, and you overlay them with socioeconomics, you find that there's a very strong correlation between race and class. So for me, I'm kind of excited to hear from our panelists and dig into it a little bit more.
I agree. I'm interested as well as in exploring sameness and difference. When I look inward at the society here in the United States, sometimes it feels like we have working class in the language of the United States and people that experience poverty, and we might have different mental images or stereotypes of who those groups are. And yet when we look at kind of our pyramid of society, those two groups might be experiencing similar struggles. So I'm also kind of excited to see where some of the similarities lie in our country and globally when it comes to inclusion of all types of leadership and skill in our workforce. We'll get started in a minute here, but I was thinking we could also pull in real quick, maybe a quick definition of class and caste.
Sounds great.
So class, at least in the ways that we will be discussing today from our FDP lens, we're talking about a group sharing the same economic or social status, even social rank. And we're going to uphold that as a global phenomenon. You're going to decide for yourself how you feel about it, including starting right now. What feelings are coming up as we begin to define class? Let's look at caste.
And caste is a division of society based on differences of wealth, inherited rank or privilege, profession, occupation, or race. And I think that while there is the mythology that when you are born into a particular class strata, you, at least in the United States, have the opportunity to move up and out of your class status into a higher class status. The caste, there is a sort of generational component to caste that makes it much more difficult, if not impossible, to move out of whatever caste you were born into.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to take a few moments to introduce the rest of our panel, and then we're going to start with a round robin question that will really kick off today's discussion. And we're looking forward to the questions that you all submit along the way. Leading off our panel today, I'll start with my colleague, Anita Basheen. As an organization development consultant, Anita has worked with clients around the globe for 20 plus years. This experience, plus being born as first-generation Indian in the melting pot of London, has cultivated a global mindset. More recently, she has aspired to add a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to her leadership and organizational development work. As the three spheres are becoming increasingly integrated. Described as nomadic, for Anita, home is where the heart is. Welcome, Anita Basheen, Senior Consultant, FDP Global. Honored to have you in the discussion today. Next, I will not be able to quite roll my letters the same, but Amalia Alacorn-Morris has been an associate with WMFDP for 18 years, working in the United States, Latin America, Asia, and Europe. During her career, she has focused her work on racial equity, diversity and inclusion in local government, nonprofit, and the private sector. Amalia Alacorn-Morris, Senior Consultant, FDP Global. Honored to have you here and honored to co-facilitate with you.
Thank you.
And taking up the rear, but definitely with the mighty boom, is Keith Blocker. As a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, consultant, and educator, Keith Blocker is highly respected and much sought after for his work as an instructional designer and facilitator. His experience includes partnering with organizations and government entities, seeking to promote equity in business practices and decision-making, increasing workforce productivity, attracting diverse talent to key positions, and designing effective communication strategies for engaging diverse groups and improving workplace culture. Keith, it's very honored to have you here today and looking forward to your voice joining our conversation. Keith Blocker, FDP Global Consultant. And to open it up now to our panelists, and maybe we'll start with Anita and followed by Keith and then Amalia. I'll take up the rear on this one. We wanted to start with a question that really allowed the panelists to kind of delve into this courageous conversation, share with ourselves parts of each other, and in a sense, invite the global community to do some reflection and begin asking questions that are coming to your heart and mind. And to kick it off, we wanted to ask the question, again, starting with Anita, what was your class experience growing up? However you define class, Anita, or if you will, your socioeconomic experience growing up. And how do you identify now?
Yeah, thanks, Noah. This was a great question to think about as I prepared for our time today. So for me, I remembered the fact that my parents arrived in the UK from India with literally the suitcases that they carried. So most of the cash they had went into the ticket for that trip to the UK. So they were literally fresh off the boat, an expression that we often hear. They came with no education, no formal education beyond what in the US we would say is middle school. And we landed, or they landed, and I was born into a community that was full of immigrants. And these immigrants were all from the colonized countries that the British had ruled. So there was somewhat of a sort of multicultural melting pot privilege that I think we had. But as I thought about it, there were things I had along the journey that now really were lucky breaks. For example, I had a teacher who really cared about me in elementary school. That allowed me to go to a gifted school, which again was a lucky break. I went at the age of 16, my parents moved out of the area that I described into a more affluent neighborhood. Again, another lucky break. And so there were a number of these things. The fact that I was able to go to college in the UK, where we have they have a much lower cost of entry into the education system. And so I was lucky enough to have grants and have that experience paid for. I also had this accent, which is a remnant of the British rule, but it does sort of give me an advantage in many ways. And it's not something people associate with my social class origins. The things I didn't have were related to the fact that I didn't have a relative who had a white collar job. So no one I knew could help me figure out how to get into the working world. When I went to college, we didn't have things like first generation college hire support. It's great to see that exists today, but that would have also been really helpful. So I realized there were things I had and things I didn't have. But what I focus on is social mobility and the fact that over time, there's been a lot of it, 50 years or so, I've been able to move through the different, classes, if you like, and that is really uplifting to know in one generation, someone can move a span multiple classes. So I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita, and we'll be bringing your voice back in momentarily. So we have a really good gumbo of panelists here, and next it's my pleasure to swing over to Keith Blocker. Keith, what was your experience like class-wise? How did you identify, or how did you live that growing up, or if you will. So what was your socioeconomic experience, and how do you identify now?
Thank you for that question, Noah. That it didn't take me long as a young young child to realize that I was growing up in poverty. I probably didn't know it was extreme poverty at the time, but most definitely was poverty. The first 25 years of my life, I lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is a very large urban city, very segregated, meaning literally white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. And it's pretty clear that poverty is concentrated in certain areas in the city. And that definitely had a significant amount of impact on myself, where I lived, the schools I went to, the quality of the schools that I attended. My mother struggled with addiction that created more problems. And thinking back, when I think about the infestation of crack cocaine in urban communities, I definitely see that as not only a class issue but a race issue, dealing with that epidemic, which greatly impacted my life. As I grew up, I was fortunate in a lot of ways, though, to have parents that loved and cared for me. They worked hard to overcome their own struggles. So education was something that was always highly valued and seen as a tool for upward mobility. So I was fortunate uh, to eventually go to college at some point. My mother raised three children who all went to college, college graduates. I love to brag on my youngest sister. She brags that she's a triple Ivy League graduate, from Yale, Columbia, and University of Pennsylvania. So when I think about, poverty, race, and class, I definitely been privileged uh, to walk through the continuum, going from being what may be considered extremely impoverished to, I would assume, something like middle class at this point. So that's kind of a bit of my story. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Hey, Keith, thanks for, as we say in the FDP global world, really bringing your heart in on that one. Just the level of courage and vulnerability and openness you brought in has put a lot of energy in. So thank you. Amalia, swing it over to you. Same question. How did you identify, and how do you identify now when it comes to class or socioeconomic status?
Yeah, so much of what Anita spoke to resonates with my own experience as well, just a different part of the world. So, my parents, both Latin American, both into the United States when I was fairly young, neither one with an education beyond grade school. And then they split, and I was raised by a single mother. And there was a benefit that I had that my mother recognized immediately, is that I have white skin and I have light eyes. And so from the very start, there were certain things that were hammered into me. One was, I need to perfect my accent so that nobody knows that I'm not one of them or that I don't belong. And so she made sure that I practiced so that I did not have an accent that would give me away. She always pushed me to make friends with people who had money. And she said, you always look for someone who can lift you up, and then you need to observe them because they behave a certain way. The ways in which they interact socially, the conversation that they have, the way they eat meals, all of those things can give you away. So you need to, I was like stealth all the time, like reconnaissance, because this was behavior that she knew I needed to adopt. Education. I was not allowed to have summer jobs. My mother worked 2 and 3 jobs, and the only thing that I was allowed to do is do educational things. The only thing that we freely spent money on were books or programs, enrichment programs, because that was very clearly my way out. We could not afford college, and so I had to have scholarships. And so everything that I did was geared towards a resume that would allow me to have scholarships so I could go to college. And then she also recognized this travel abroad thing that so many young people, by the time they got to college, had this experience. And so unbeknownst to me, she saved money. So my mother cleaned people's houses. She took in sewing. She worked at a factory doing sewing. And she saved money over the 4 years of my high school and then gifted me a summer trip to Europe and Israel with a college group of kids. So again, traveling with young people who could afford to do this and having that international travel experience to have conversation, to enrich me in terms of how I interacted with people. How I identify now is a very interesting question because I have 2 sons. They're both adopted from the foster care system. And my oldest son, just recently, they're both adults now, got connected with his birth family and had a death in the family and went to the funeral. And he has 10 birth siblings. And he said to me after the experience, "Mom, I just looked around and there's a lot of issues with drug misuse. There's everybody hustle, trying to find a way to survive." And I just took a second and I realized I did not grow up this way. I grew up middle class, upper middle class, and I just don't relate to the ways, the stress with which the rest of my birth family lives their life. And to me, that's where I am. That's where we identify, and that is the hopes, the highest hopes of my mother made reality for my life and my children's lives.
Thank you all 3. Wow, I'm excited for the conversation. I'll add in my little pepper to the pot and we'll keep it moving here. I think for me, I definitely, let's see, I grew up with my dad is first generation American, similar to some of Amalia's family. His family is Holocaust survivors. So my grandpa fled the Nazis in World War II. Pretty much my dad's entire side of the family was wiped out. And in Europe, they were definitely in shtetls and they were definitely in the poverty of working class. So I was not the stereotype of a rich Jew in Europe that was controlling empires. My people were definitely humble. And when my dad came here to America, he was born in New York City. My mom is second generation and grew up in Southside Chicago in public housing and homeless. And she ended up becoming a bit of a radical in her family. She ended up marching with Dr. King in the 60s. She ended up participating in kind of peace movements, if you will. Met my dad in the Peace Corps, and they lived abroad for about 13 or 14 years, mostly in Micronesia, and then the latter part in the Middle East. I was born in Isfahan, Iran, in 78, and my parents came here. So mind you, my mom grew up in poverty. My dad grew up first generation American Holocaust survivor, and they'd been in the Peace Corps. It wasn't like there was money in their equation. They did have a stipend from the Peace Corps. They came back to the East Coast, and then they decided they'd heard about a place called Seattle from friends. So they came out here. And here's where I'm going to plant the seeds of caste just a little bit. So we came to Seattle, and the neighborhood that my parents had the money for and were interested in was a working class neighborhood in the south side of the city. And the real estate agent said, "Wait a second, let me show you something else." And he took them to the north end of the city, which is all white and working class, and showed them a double plot in an area of the north side of Seattle called Ballard. And they were able to secure this plot from the backgrounds that I just said for $25,000 in 82 or 83. That house today is worth $1.2 million. It's we don't have a trust fund. They still grew up from the backgrounds they came up with, but that house is now a trust fund for me, my sister, and our children. And here's the Caste thing just a little bit before we move on. My parents were steered there because, well, unbeknownst to them, and really unbeknownst to me till years later, we think of segregation in America as down south, right? A lot of times the southern states, but there are housing covenant laws, even in Seattle, Washington, that dictated which social groups could buy houses in which part of the city. And even though those laws had ended about 12 or 14 years in practice, legally, before my parents were steered to that house, the cultural landscape of who bought in what part of the city, what the prime real estate lots were, where the interest was going to go up, was well known. And my parents' Judaism was not well known in that moment. So they got steered as a white couple to the north side of the city. That's how it works in one lifetime. I grew up working class. I'm upper middle class now. And I definitely didn't grow up with it all. And I'm definitely raising a daughter who's in a private school that costs thousands of dollars a year. So that's part of that continuum. We just have a few more minutes to marinate together before we begin to interact with our audience. But I want to see Amalia, Anita, Keith, did you want to add anything else or any other perspectives come to your mind before we start bringing in our poll and engaging our audience?
Yeah, I think we all talked about movement and moving from one class to another. And it's worth putting into the pot, I think, that in the United States, only about 7% of the population are able to move from the lowest to the top class in their generation. So it's sort of, and that varies a lot by place. So the place that you grew up really makes a huge difference in that.
And I hear then that it's also not systemic. It's not an expectation, and that's built in our society to help people elevate. If I read between the lines of what you're saying, that's powerful. Keith, Amalia, anything else to bring in?
Just thinking that I often think that perhaps my generation may have been the last generation to where there was that expectation that there was a possibility of movement. I think younger generations are much more clear on the fact that of how hard it actually is to have that kind of movement and opportunities. While there are some helps that are in place that weren't earlier, I think opportunities, given our socioeconomic and political realities in the United States, have dwindled over time.
So a generational perspective too, and where does that continuum continue to go? Keith, any last words from you before our audience poll?
Yeah, just thinking about your story, Noah, in terms of the housing and where people are steered to live. Those things are intentional, and I think about where I grew up, in Philadelphia, where there was a significant amount of white flight. It was very intentional in terms of allowing the value of housing to decrease in certain neighborhoods while the value of housing increased in other neighborhoods. And we're talking about decades and of billions and billions of dollars of equity loss in housing just because people were Black and white flight happened in many cities across the country. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, I hear from you saying, and in a sense, Blocker, Keith, the intersection of race and class. When we look at things like generational wealth gaps in America, it's not necessarily by accident or circumstance. There's some reasons why things are ending up the ways they are. Thank you for that. Amalia, can I swing it over to you or Claire to bring in our audience poll?
Yeah, if Claire could post that would be great. So you should see a pop-up in the middle of your screen that has a number of statements. And so the desire here is to have you answer these to the best of your ability. Don't super overthink it, and then hit submit, because we want to just sort of take the pulse of the group that is with us today. Similar to the questions that we were just asked to open the conversation. This is a way of getting some sense of how you all experience this topic in your own lives and professions. So quickly go through. Again, don't overthink. I know that we're giving you binary answer choices and you might feel like, well, some of the time, or just do your best and then hit submit, and then we'll see where you all are.
Thank you.
And if anyone has any difficulty seeing the poll, please just chat us and let us know.
As you complete that poll too, please continue to submit questions as you've been doing to our producers. We will be surfacing those questions and answering them from a panel perspective in just a few moments.
And I think I may have just misspoken because I don't think you can chat. I don't think the chat function is available on webinars. So I'm sorry I misspoke on that. Set a false expectation.
Oh.
Hopefully you all can see this. I can fill it out and hit submit.
All right. When you're wearing a fantastic necklace like that, you're allowed to make a mistake every now and
Well,
then.
you know, we're talking about class, so I had to find pearls. I mean, really.
Don't cast
Well,
your
Mom
pearls
would be proud of you, Amalia.
Thank you. She worked very hard, as you can
I
tell.
don't think she would,
by my
because
story.
you're hanging out with me, and I know that you're not supposed to cast pearls among swine. So no, just kidding. Just give this poll another moment, and our own Anita will help us look at some of our responses.
And these responses, by the way, we will only see them in the aggregate. So nobody's individual response will be tied to any individual person.
Thanks for saying that. And producers, in a moment of transparency, we're just leaning on you to reveal the stats when you feel they're in.
Well, there were 10 unusual questions, probably questions you don't get every day. So let's maybe take a look at them and see where we landed. So you can definitely see a trend towards more true than false, I think, in almost all the cases. So it's also really interesting to think about how you might have answered these questions today in the present time versus perhaps when you were younger. You know, if you, like many of us in the panel, talked about our earlier days and our experience, it could be really interesting to think for yourselves about where you are today relative to where you came from. So thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I'm sure some of these questions have triggered some more questions for you. So please feel free to enter those questions into the Q&A box. We will get to them as we can. We'll definitely take them as we go through the conversation versus waiting until the end. And also, if you have a question for one of us specifically, please let us know if you've got something in mind that you want to explore a little further with one of us. That's perfectly fine too. So with that, we can move on.
Yes, and we are definitely starting to get questions in here. This is very cool. Okay, what I'm going to do, panel, is I'm going to begin by starting with some of our audience questions, and I'm going to direct them to different members of the panel, and we'll start our rich conversation. And audience, just so you know, and a little later, we have a couple other, I would say, treats or food for thought in store too. So it's quite the robust conversation today. This first one is actually addressed to Anita, so that helps. I'm going to read this to you, Anita. Anita, I find that some in the non-resident Indian community who migrate overseas still struggle with the baggage of class and caste distinctions that are carried over from their home country, which colors their interactions with others from the same ethnic background in the countries they now live. When we talk about social justice, some of these issues in the immigrant communities themselves need to be examined. Any thoughts?
Yeah, lots of thoughts about that, because not only were my parents immigrants to the UK, but then I'm an immigrant to the US. So I've had a lot of time to think about this. And one of the things I realized is in my parents' case, you know, they were so focused on survival. I could see how they were colluding with power, if you like. You know, they were trying to get along so that they could survive. And in some cases, there's even a name for that, the Stockholm Syndrome. You may have heard of it, that the idea that you would pal up with the hostages that were in charge of you, just so that you could improve your own situation. So I think that is something that immigrants face. And then Indian immigrants specifically had such programming from the caste system, you know, which goes back thousands of years. And that actually what we're seeing now is some of that has come into, some of that thinking has come with those immigrants, especially into the tech industry. So just recently there was the first of what I think are going to be many lawsuits. It was filed by the California Department of Fair Employment against Cisco, where one of the lower caste members of a team was making a complaint against more upper class members of the Indian, from the Indian caste system. So that is definitely coming, moving, and I can go into it in more detail if people are interested, but that is moving into our system here in the US for sure.
I needed just a little light flavor on top of that. Even from an FDP global perspective, it's fascinating sometimes, especially these days. We work with the multinational. Traditionally, what we would call in our FDP language, the insider group is usually white, male, hetero, cisgendered. And we're also working with a lot of multinationals where the insiders are also sometimes Indian men from perhaps an upper caste, and they are also experiencing insiderness, yet there's still a difference between them and some of the US insiders. So there's all these layers and levels to it. And I appreciate how you just tucked some of that back. Keith, I'm going to come over to you for this next one. And it's not addressed to you, but I'm interested on your take on it. The writer says, as someone who grew up in poverty, I've internalized many of the messages I received as a youth. Even though I'm well educated and accomplished adult, I find it still inhibits my voice depending on the audience. Is that a common issue? And let me say, I'm not pointing you because I know this to be true or not true about you. I just am interested in your take and the ways that I know you speak in an open way.
Let me think about that a second.
I can restate it too if you'd like. Okay,
yeah.
One more time. Someone is writing saying they've internalized messages when they grew up in poverty about what poverty means. I'm going to read between the lines and assume they've received negative messages about their self-worth, who they are, how society sees them. And they're saying that they've gotten to a level of success now in their life, but sometimes those inside voices still tug at them. Does that happen to other people that kind of grew up in other ways of, my words here, I'm going to use the word oppression, but other forms of struggle? Is it common to have, I guess, an internal doubt or voice? And I'll open this up to the other panelists too. I'm not really trying to single out anybody here.
No, that's a good question. Thanks, Noah.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like this person is kind of talking about what could be considered a poverty mindset.
What's that?
It's the idea that there's nothing but scarcity. People generally speaking, don't see resources or access to resources as being abundant or something that they are deserving of. And if there's a mental block, even if there are resources available and you haven't been exposed or been taught how to get access or gain access to those resources, that's a mental barrier. Thinking about the idea of There's no such thing as I can't,
Mm.
those kind of things. So I do think there is, to some degree, mental blocks when people are, when poverty is consolidated to one area. You can't see the opportunities that may or may not exist.
Mm.
So I know for me, having exposure,
Mm.
and being introduced to different opportunities, um, was beneficial for me growing up. And in my opinion, that's how I was able to be a part of that 7 or 8% of people who are able to get out of poverty. But yeah, you oftentimes you do struggle with, um, things like, should I dress a certain way? Because I have less, I need to, externally show more, right? I need to buy certain things to show that I'm not poor. I need to dress a certain way to show that I'm not poor. Um, so, you know, using the external to kind of mitigate what you feel like is lacking on the inside. Something that I've definitely struggled with, but as I've grown older and got more mature, it's been something that's easier to navigate through.
Thank you, Keith. Amalia, you want to add a lens to that as well?
Yeah, I want definitely to echo the scarcity mentality piece that Keith talked about. This idea of when is it enough, that I'm far enough away from that one catastrophic thing that will put me back where I started, the medical bills or illness, the layoff or reorg at my job, COVID. And also this idea of the imposter syndrome. So I grew up with a group of people, same beginnings as me, and we're still 60, 50, 40 years later, still best friends. And we've all gotten to the place where I'm at. We're all upper middle class people now. But we often talk about being in corporate settings, for example, and feeling like we are undercover, and any moment our cover is going to be blown and someone's going to show us the door. But clearly you made a mistake. You don't belong here, so we're going to show you the door. Because there's this concept of passing. Yep. And I can pass as a white person. I can pass as an upper class person. Because of all the studying that I was made to do by my mother intentionally as a child. Sure, I wasn't born into it. So at any moment, there's this underlying fear that something will come out that will give me away, that will show that I'm not as good or good enough to be in these spaces with everyone else. Wow. And so that is one of the things that came up for me hearing the question, and I just wanted to throw it out there.
Well, I appreciate that deeply as a guy that only recently really started identifying as a white dude that actually did grow up working class and is definitely the upper middle class now. One thing I can be honest about, and with 118 of my favorite strangers, is that if I'm really honest, sometimes I collude with exclusion when I'm protecting my upward class because of my scarce mentality. I just said a bunch of mumbo jumbo, but let me say what I'm saying from the heart. I've been on parts of teams that have set where sexism, all types of stuff has been going on. And younger in my career, there's been times when I haven't always leaned in and intervened and interrupted. And that scarcity mentality of, well, you got in here, and if you speak up and keep it real, they're going to kick you right back out. I've experienced that a couple of times in my career, and I know it happens for many of our clients and others today. In fact, I think it's one of the things that keeps sometimes the, if you will, the system in place. And so I appreciate both of you kind of picking the skin off of that and letting me think about that from a different angle. Want to bring in a question. I'm going to take a stab at this one for myself and then open it back up. But the question was, I've spent 40 years focused on enhancing white male consciousness. I'd love your perspective on how to get white males to recognize the changes we must make as being in our personal self-interest. I mean, to me, this is one of the meats of the question of why we're having this today. When we look at when we look at the extremely divided, extremely polarized landscape in this country. One of the groups that we see, and we saw them emerge as I would even say a political power block of sorts in the last 4 years, is working class white people. And I'm not going to go into a whole which way you should vote type of thing. That's not what this intention is. But what I increasingly see is that group labeled, and even my experience with that group at personally and professionally, is that there can be a mental block for working white class as far as seeing inclusion and upward mobility and inclusion is part of the same thing. It seems like it's usually a zero-sum game. If I move up, this person needs to stay beneath so I can. And if this group cuts ahead of me in line, I'm going down a notch on that social or caste ladder. And I believe a lot of this work, one of the reasons I want to talk about class is so that white men and others, we can talk about some of those struggles where maybe we weren't fully feeling ourselves or confident or included in the system. And actually, it's okay to honor that. And it's okay to then also look at who are other folks that are having that similar experience then or now that we weren't aware of, and what does that new knowledge do for our leadership mindset and our ability to be inclusive and our ability to look at some of our unconscious bias. So I think for me, it's almost a life and death issue. We really do need people to speak more honestly about ways they came up in the system. And when we do so, I often find too, for my group, that the default is that rugged individualism that says, well, I made it, I'll pull myself up by my bootstraps. Why can't they? And we divorce ourselves of the opportunity to see some of the systemic barriers and ways that we personally can be more inclusive of others. I know that was written for white guys, so I really want to take a first crack at that, but any other perspectives?
I can add to that. No, I think if particularly if white males were able to put themselves in marginalized people's shoes, meaning that recognizing that there are systems at play that impacts their ability to earn a wage, to live a certain place, go to a certain school, it will help them to see that those same systems impact them as well, and sometimes impact them to give them the advantage. But there are often times where those same systems are put in place that create a disadvantage for white men. And white men aren't able to see that those systems are in play that are impacting other people, then it limits their ability to see how it impacts them. And one example of that is the loss of jobs in our country in general, us not being as much of an industrialized country, which led to the loss of manufacturing jobs. When that happens when it happened in the Black community, it was an awareness that those jobs are gone and there was systems in place. It wasn't that white men took those jobs, but when from the reverse, it's often seen as those people took those jobs, or the Chinese people took our jobs, where in reality it was systems in place that took those positions, that took those jobs, that took that industry away from our country, that impacted everybody, right? But if white men could see that it was a system, it'd put less burden on their individual ability to get access to good employment.
Appreciate that. Thanks for that. That take. Amalia, I want to come to you with a different question than Anita. You got another one written to you. Amalia, said somebody want to follow up. Earlier speaker said she mentioned the poverty she grew up with inhibits her voice, and depending on the audience she's with. Can any more of the panelists speak to that fact? I grew up in poverty, and sometimes I feel like speaking with certain classes of people won't believe me when I tell them something. So I want to come back to that earlier comment and really make sure we're speaking to that. It sounds like that speaker was talking about, I have kind of like Amalia said, internalized this at times inferior sense, less of self because of how I grew up. So I want to spin that a different way. Can anyone speak to, not the magic bullet to that, but a way maybe if you've recognized that in yourself, one of the practices you've done to unravel that? Any thoughts on that?
So I'll jump in while my fellow panelists think about that, because I bet there's some answers there. But our big motto in my house is fake it till you make it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, my children growing up, we put them in speech and debate, we put them in theater, any kind of work that would help them almost learn how to recite lines in a convincing way, learn how to convince people and sort of sway them, because it takes some sense of ability to be able to be convincing and to be able to recite lines. Sometimes, like I'm playing a different character, I have to say, it sounds weird, but I can't tell you how often growing, when I was like in my 20s, I would watch a movie where there was a strong female professional, and I would repeat the lines. I would watch it over and over, and I would literally repeat the lines and sort of take the stance and posture as a way to practice what it felt like in my body to inhabit a person who had the right and the authority and the power to be in a space with other people. I still would walk in a room full of white guys in suits and quake in my boots, right? But I had some sense of, okay, this is how I have to, this feeling that I have to bring up. And I know I have good things to say. I take some notes so I don't stumble. So I've got some clear, concise things to say, and practice, practice, practice. That is the only way. I'm nearly 60 and it still comes up for me, right? It has never gone away. It's gotten better.
I appreciate that. I had a talk. I mean, I'm an insider in a lot of groups, but the class piece is one area where I'm kind of straddle the line between outsider and insider. I'm definitely an insider now, but growing up, it was not like that. And so that's the one area, especially when I first started doing this FDP global work, and it would show up in different ways. I'd try to shake a female executive's hand at a certain company and realize that was not quite maybe that wasn't the right kind of handshake. Or I remember going out to dinner a few times and using the wrong cutlery, and just those types of things where I was like, okay, this still a little bit interesting here. One thing I noticed about myself though was I worked with a personal therapist, and I had my self-talk when I felt that I was not performing to par was vicious. I mean, I call myself the worst words, and I wouldn't even do it consciously. So rewriting those and figuring out ways to turn my self-talk into affirmations and slow down. I even write them on a sticky note, put it in a mirror sometimes as a way of building that confidence that Amalia was talking about. I'm 42. I was a child of the hip hop generation. Believe it or not, I used to have little hair. I was an MC back in the day, and that actually gave me confidence. So anything that, like Amalia says, gives you the confidence in how to speak your truth and let the world know it is a stage and you were an actor on it is pretty good for the psychology. So Anita, we got room for a couple more questions here. Can you please talk about Indian women and caste in a new country? Does being in a new country help women transcend caste and caste expectations and limitations? And how might age play in that struggle? I can repeat that if you need that.
Great question. And so pertinent also. Yeah, if you can repeat it, I want to just focus.
Absolutely. Anita, can you please talk about Indian women and caste in a new country? Does being in a new country help women transcend caste and caste expectations? How does age play into the struggle?
Yeah, so I think I would like to think it helps women to be in a new place and have a different set of expectations on them. But I think what I'm realizing is so much of the caste system is in you. And so we carry it with us wherever we are. And it is hard to escape that conditioning that you may have had, from very early age. So this idea of how we are in meetings or like, so for me as an Indian woman, there's something around deference that still shows up in me because my parents would defer to the British or the system. And so that is hard to escape. It's still work in progress. And even though I came to this, great new land of opportunity, it's still in me, even though people might look at me differently. Although to my earlier point, women, again, in the tech sector, that's where I've done most of my work. Indian women specifically there is now a class action lawsuit for Dalit or untouchable Indian tech workers. So again, I think it's just showing that you carry it with you. The people that have come from India carry it with them, regardless of whether, native-born Americans even know about the Indian caste system. It's in the system. And age, I think, is a whole nother topic. So definitely.
Join us next week. No.
That's a good one for a news webinar.
Although I do appreciate, Anita, that you because there's another question out here I'd also addressed to you, which I'm going to save for our collective in a little bit. They're asking, can you address the difference between caste and class? I'm going to read between the lines of that question and what you just commented on. One of the interesting things is, do we perceive the caste system strictly in India? Right? Is caste something that's in India? Is class something that's in America? I really wonder about that increasingly, especially with this talk about race that we're bringing in. That's something that I find can be unsettling at times to other insiders. The fact that, are there remnants, are there pieces of a caste system here? But I want to hold on to that for just a minute because we're going to peel back that. Keith, and we have room for 2 more questions here. And Amalia, I want to bring you in. Okay. The one I want to bring in first, this is a comment, Amalia and Keith, but this person has said it twice, and it strikes me in the heart each time. This person has said, I'm sad in this conversation to hear that code switching and assimilation are the ways forward if you're an outsider. This perpetuates racism and dominant culture. That's a really powerful statement, and it hit me in the heart. I've noticed it twice. Any thoughts to that? I'll say it one more time. In this conversation, I've noticed, by listening to us, in other words, that code switching and assimilation are the ways forward if you're from for instance, lower caste or class. This perpetuates racism and dominant culture. Any thoughts or feelings on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that all the time. I think for me to maintain my own sense of sanity, I have to navigate the world in a way that I feel is authentic. So when I think about code switching, I guess to some degree you could make that synonymous with assimilation. But I think there's other aspects to code switching. When I think about culture. When I think about code switching, I think, if when I'm around, grandma, I kind of carry myself a certain way, right? Because grandma has created a certain culture in her home, and I've learned to follow and navigate, grandmom's way of doing things, right? So like if I was to go to Japan or another country and I learned the culture that they operate under, so that I could get access to resources or build relationships. To me, that's the same as me as a Black male going into corporate white male culture and figuring out how they operate, how they navigate, how they communicate, so I could get access to the resources that I need within that culture. I don't see that as giving up myself or selling out. I see that as being savvy and smart and recognizing that wherever I go, there's going to be a different culture that I may have to figure out how to operate so that I could get my needs met within that culture. So no, it is a challenge though. Tokenism is an issue, but I think it's really about the mindset of the individual. Thinking about the caste system, and to the point of it's in you no matter where you go. That's an interesting thing, right? Like dealing with your own internalized thoughts of who you are based upon what other people have placed on you. And I think as long as you're constantly fighting that and being honest with yourself about that, then as you navigate different cultures and different institutions, you could do it in a way that's authentic.
Thank you, Keith. I would like to add something on there, and then Amalia, a question just came in for you. And I first acknowledging again, I want to say it with humility, because I do acknowledge many realms I have privilege in. I think my work with other insiders in the US is actually helping them understand that when they want inclusion and equity in their company, that assimilation and code switching aren't going to get them there. So there's a humble side of me that says I don't have to play that game in some ways the way Keith or Amalia or Anita does. So I say that very humbly, but from working with other insiders, I don't think we're leveraging the power of inclusion, which we define inclusion equaling uniqueness times belonging, all the different ways I'm unique, actually belonging and credible and part of the organization. I don't think we're leveraging and getting the power of diversity through equity and inclusion if we're requiring outsiders assimilate and code switch. And I think it happens far too much. So on the individual level, even on my class experience, heck yeah, I'd code switch in a second to make the money I do now to support my daughter. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, I'm still belonging to all the cultural and civic organizations that also make a change. And I have family and friends that ground me. I have a spiritual practice. So I say that humbly, but yeah, my work is helping leaders understand that if people are coming in there needing to assimilate and code switch, we do not have an inclusive culture. Amalia, do you see similar limitations? Question for Amalia as she's living in Central America. Do you see similar limitations for Latina, Hispanic women in Central America, or women in general, as there are here in the USA based on class and caste, regardless of education? Would you like me to read that again a little more cleanly?
Yes, please.
Do you see similar limitations for Latina, Hispanic women in Central America as it's not quite written. I'm sorry, I'm trying to edit it for you on the spot. Do you see similar limitations for Latina, Hispanic women in Central America as there are here in the US based on class and caste?
Yeah, and gender. Yes, I definitely see it, and in some ways even more marked than exists in the United States. I do want to say one quick thing about the previous question.
Yes.
And I love everything that both of you said, and I agree wholeheartedly with both. I just want to say that for survival's sake, many times we are taught to navigate the world as it is, not necessarily as we would like it to be. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes it can be a sign of privilege for others who look in our practices and say, maybe that's the wrong way to approach it, because for us, it really literally is about survival. And we will do whatever we have to do in order to survive in the system. The question is, once we get to a place where we are as panelists, what is the work that we do to begin to change the system, to your point, Noah? So I just want to say that. In terms of what women face, I believe there is a compounding effect in Latin America around class and gender that is more marked in Latin America because the legal recourses aren't what they are in the United States. So the United States system is not perfect by a long shot. And there are recourses to be had as a woman and as someone who came up in the lower classes than there is in Latin America. And so when you look at people who are in authority here in Latin America, they are all European descended. That's a broad generalization because you will find one or another. But the ruling class, if you will, here in Central America, and I find it to be the truth in other places in South America, other than in Panama and Central America, are all European descended. You will see the images that are put forth as beautiful in terms of advertisement are all US-based, European-based standards of beauty. And this coming from a country that is, I would say, probably 75% African and indigenous descended, if not more. And so there is still an effect on the ways we see ourselves as women in terms of our attractiveness, our viability, and our capacity to find a way up. So they say, if you can see it, you can be it. And you can't, if you happen to be a Black or brown woman in Latin America, particularly in Central and South America, you can't see it. There are places where that is different because we're not a monolith, but that's my experience here in Panama, which is, it is very surprising given what the demographics of the general population look like. And it is the first indication that there is a class and race systemic issue in the country, where there may not be interpersonal racism or classism as you maybe see in the United States on a day-to-day. You can see the effects of the systemic when you look at who it is that is in power in our companies and in our government.
Thank you, Amalia. As you were sharing that, another question came in directed towards me. How to coach white people who inadvertently dismiss others' experience by saying, well, I made something of myself despite my circumstances. What's a reframe we can offer? I'll take a crack at it, and then Anita, I haven't heard your voice in a while, if you want to add it, and certainly Amalia and Keith as well. I think for, a lot of times when we address this within FDP, my take would be helping that person understand the individual group paradox first. So how I might unpack that is say, yeah, individually, there are some parts about your personality, your work effort, your drive that absolutely it sounds like have helped you go after your goals and get in a good place in life. And I want to celebrate that. From my perspective, there's also another part of our identity. That's the group identity. Which groups do we belong to? So I also grew up working class. I know what it wasn't like not to have all the money on the table every day. I also grew up male and white. And so sometimes I think, what are the individual ways I got lucky? What are the individual ways I have skill and was noticed for that? And what are some of the ways that as a group, I was able to be accepted in the system that perhaps some other people weren't because they weren't in the same group? Still a little bit intellectual. I'd like to get that a little more from the heart, but that's one way I would help somebody think about that. How are you both an individual and a group? And I would give props to their individual person who overcame difficult circumstances, and I would challenge their insider group identities, whether that was white, male, heterosexual, whatever, in the sense of saying there may have been some wind at our backs on parts of that we didn't notice. Anita, would you add anything before swinging over to Amalia and Keith?
I like what you said, Noah, and I think I might overemphasize the groupness and the collective. Like, so what about the people that get left behind that you went to school with? What would it be like for them if we could lift everyone up versus focus on self? So I think we underplay collective thinking in the US. And there's a great opportunity to say, what about those that are left behind?
I like that. That's a beautiful, heartfelt, and powerful intervention. Producers, I'm going to come with one last question, and then I'm also wondering, producers, if you could have my the Caste quote from Isabel Wilkinson on deck. So one last question I want to reach into for the panel. This is a great discussion, class, caste, and race. We should discuss light skin, dark skin issue that is a conversation most are having. A dark-skinned person with education and Ivy background is still competing with counterparts that are light-skinned and closer to white. Any thoughts on that? So directly bringing in, here we go a little bit now. I'm gonna, as a segue to our video, I, growing up, associate caste with India. That's what I was taught. I notice that people get offended sometimes when I suggest, is there a caste system in America based on race and class? And I don't mean to be offensive. I'm using inquiry in my heart. That's what I notice. That's what I experience. But I notice people say, no, that's only in another country. And then also being a descendant of Jewish heritage, I define what my family escaped, the Holocaust, a caste system where my people were the lowest ring in that one. I think dark-skinned and low income is a class system in America, a caste system in America, but that's my personal thought. I'm wondering, as I go around to Amalia, Anita, and Keith on this idea of colorism, light-skinned and dark-skinned, as each of you have kind of made different comments about complexion in this, how does that tie in to caste, in your opinion?
I could start with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think colorism is a global phenomenon. It's not something that's just obviously not just in the Americas. It's colorism is rooted in anti-Blackness. It reinforces the idea of white supremacy. And when we think about slavery and how it came about in the United States of America, it was an easy way to create a class system. I mean, prior to slavery, we had indentured servitude, where Black and white people, did that work for 7 years of the indentured service. And it was an easy way to distinguish the lower class by creating slavery. And it reinforced, racism reinforced the class system that was already in place, right? And when we think about colorism within, the Black community, the Asian American community, the Latino community, it's all an attempt to step away from what is deemed as Blackness, because resources were taken away, opportunities were taken away, people, people's self-worth was rooted in colorism, and the closer you are, or the closer your proximity was to whiteness, deemed you to be more deserving of resources or access.
So in light of that, global and also personal, and I'm going to say even you and US, all those combined, Amalia, how does that connect? How do you connect with the colorism comment and when thinking about caste and class?
Well, I feel like I'm very aware that my skin color is directly responsible for my capacity to have achieved what I achieved. And my mother was very aware that that was the case, because when I was born and she saw my coloring, she immediately was like, this kid has an opportunity that I didn't have. This kid has an opportunity that some of our other family members don't have. And so I'm going to cultivate that in her so she gets out. There's an expression in Latin America, and I've heard it, my family is from Ecuador, Cuba, and I've also heard it from other people in other countries, that is mejorando la raza, which is about improving the race. And it's this idea that you marry whiter and your children are whiter and you lighten your lineage, because that results in opportunity. I don't hear it as much anymore as I did when I was a child, but it was a very common thread. So there is definitely, colorism is definitely at play in Latin America for sure, as much as it is in the United States. And I do think it has here in Latin America colonizer roots. It has its roots in the Spaniards who came to colonize Latin America, creating that caste system, as Keith spoke of in the United States with the system of slavery. And it still has impact today. And I think about that prior question that you asked, and how do you reach, white men who are saying, well, I worked hard and I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, why can't someone else? And for me, it's this idea that my truth is not everyone's universal truth, and that everyone carries a different experience of similar circumstances. And how can you open up as a leader to gather as many of those puzzle pieces to see a bigger truth within which someone may have different struggles because of, so you have your struggles, Noah, and others may have different struggles that are based on the way the world sees something innate about them, whether it's their skin color or their gender, for example, as something that maybe is easier to see as the way they present. And that's an additional struggle that maybe you, Noah, didn't have to have because of the way that you present. So that makes me think about it in terms of, some of us within our communities that are minoritized still have the privilege of being able to transcend because of colorism and its impact in our communities.
Anita, coming last to you, bringing in the Indian London perspective here and your own personal perspective. How would you relate to that question?
If we're talking about color and class, it's really, especially in our corporate settings, it's good to remember that social class isn't a protected class. So there isn't a lot of work focused on class.
That's true.
But so as we put our programs together, I would just encourage people to really look for the diversity within the diversity. So if you're looking at color, great, but let's look at class and within color. And, an example might be, you might be recruiting from historically Black colleges, but about half of those students are coming from middle class background. So make sure you're targeting the lower class if that's what your goal is. But, to be honest, a lot of companies don't even have goals around class. And so that's something else to think about. Another webinar topic.
That was powerful, though. I didn't realize that class isn't a protected class. So even when we think about systemic realities, inclusion, exclusion, that's powerful. I was going to segue out of this, but we have, as my producer pointed out, a writer that desperately keeps trying to reach Keith, and it's a powerful question. So Keith, we're going to go to you one more time here, and then we'll get into a couple slides in a video. Code switching intentionally, ? I grew up middle of the lane. It doesn't matter where I am. I am still seen and also not seen. It's hard when the world intentionally dismisses me. I've never understood my mother's pain until now. I'm struggling being considered a token, like Keith said. I have valuable input, but I have to fight to be included, and I'm tired. How do you get past the exhaustion of the struggle, Keith?
Well, I think the struggle continues. It's an ongoing thing. I find for me, if I'm struggling too much without getting the results that I want from a particular environment, I start thinking about my exit plan. I try not to spend too much time in areas where I'm not being valued, and I seek out places and opportunities and people who will see my value. And I know that's not easy to do. That's something that I've learned to do over time with increased maturity. But for me, the code switching piece is something that oftentimes is necessary. And it is about survival, right? It's about, but for me, it goes past surviving. I have to get to the point where I'm thriving. Survival mode is not healthy.
That's right.
And that should always be temporary.
Right.
And we want to seek out thriving. So if you find yourself struggling at work, time to get creative, time to seek out other opportunities. If people just aren't hearing you, then they probably won't hear you no matter how much you speak or how loud you are. And for me, I tend to not be loud or pushy, and I find ways to get what I want. So I would say start seeking out different places where you feel more valuable.
Amalia, Anita, any 2 words of wisdom on top of that?
One thing that Keith is bringing to mind for me is there's such a focus on culture fit, when really, as organizations, if we could reframe that to be, what can this person add to our culture? We could go a long way to address this issue.
Oh, that's a good one, Anita. I'm jacked on the spot, but I will give you credit. Amalia.
I would just, the only thing I'd add to what my colleagues have already said is it's really important to have something outside of this work struggle to help bolster you, to have friends, to have support, to have therapy, to have, because the struggle is real and it will physically kill you. It has real in the body impacts. And so if you can't, for whatever the reason, find an exit plan, find support, a place where you can vent, where you are believed, where people will hear you and not try to fix anything, but just give you a place to be fully you. And that's the only way that I have found to restore the strength and the fuel and the energy to go back and do it again.
Thank you, Amalia. So if we could, at this point in time, producers, bring in our slide of Caste from the Isabel Wilkinson book. Just hold this up for a second. Caste is insidious and therefore powerful because it is not hatred. It is not necessarily personal. It is the worn grooves of comforting routines and unthinking expectations, patterns of a social order that have been in place for so long that it looks like the natural order of things. And I'd ask all 93 of you out there, if we didn't put any name on top of here, if we didn't say India, we didn't say Nazi Germany, we didn't say US, but we had this quote, does that feel maybe like a place where you live or work at times, or a country where that you've experienced at times? And if so, what feelings come up underneath you for that? The other thing we'd like to do real quick is, can we just share maybe 4 or 5 examples of class privilege so people get some of the day-to-day examples of what we're thinking about when we talk about this energy expended, this mental calorie, this physical toll on the body? I think that'd be really helpful. And remember, in the FDP, if we could just, thank you. If we could just get a couple of the examples of, again, class privilege in there.
I think it's back a couple of slides, maybe.
Yeah, you're pretty far forward. Nope. Okay. Well, let's, okay. So we're gonna, sorry, slight technical snafu there. We'll come in with the video now in our final 6 minutes. Amalia, you can say something?
No, I was just looking for some to, maybe we can just read some out loud and not necessarily have them on the slides.
Okay.
And I don't know if you have access to that list, and that's what I was looking for.
Oh, no, I do not. Let's go to the video at this point in time.
Okay.
Okay, great. So if we could, I'm sorry, that's my fault, everybody. Preparation is always a great thing. Can we bring back in the video one more time? My apologies to all.
All right, transition to the video.
So we're gonna get ready to close off a video that may push some of us between the comfort zone and the growth zone. I just want to acknowledge that. This video looks at class, caste, and race, and it is their perspective on kind of the impact of those 3. So again, notice what you think and feel as you take in this video. Permission to agree or disagree. I also would encourage you one more time to think about that quote we just held up from Caste about these worn, insidious grooves that are been around for so long we don't even think about them sometimes. With that, let's take in this quick clip.
The man on the face of the $20 bill is the same man who once offered up to 325 times that amount for the return of a runaway enslaved person, including extra bonuses for every 100 lashes inflicted upon that man. He was a master planter who fertilized American soil with Native American bodies and hydrated Southern cotton fields with the blood and sweat of free black labor. Such an icon of white supremacy was he that nearly 200 years after launching the violent displacement of 100,000 non-white bodies, a piece of paper with his face on it was all the authorization they needed to suffocate a man to death while the world watched them do it. Big Floyd was murdered by police outside of a grocery store. See, my uncles also operate grocery stores, liquor stores, mini marts, and so on. That whole generation followed a pretty simple formula. You put your heads down, make your money, send your kids to good schools. See, what that actually meant was, put your heads down and don't think about why this formula works out for you but doesn't always work out for everyone else. Why you get to own property in this neighborhood but the people who live here can't. Why liquor stores like yours are on every corner but fresh produce and after-school programs are pretty hard to come by. And definitely don't consider a centuries-long history in this nation that includes slavery, legalized segregation, a made-up war on drugs, criminalization of black and brown bodies, immunity for police officers when they commit crimes, and that's just to name a few. So what do? We put our heads down. We turned those Jacksons into Benjamins and those Benjamins into Benzes. We became well-educated, well-to-do, and accommodating. We complied with the status quo that keeps telling us that we're almost there, but just not quite them enough until we shed every last remnant of our heritage. Except, of course, for the ones that can be exploited for a diversity initiative or sold for profit. And in the meantime, we got all our music, culture, fashion, sports heroes from a community of people without ever having to reckon with the fact that we have been complicit in the violence against their very existence all along. We kept our heads down, now the joke's on us. We abandoned our homelands and everything we knew to escape poverty, to escape violent conditions, to escape systemic oppression. And this whole time, we remained silent while we watched those very same things happen to a group of people who are just slightly different from ourselves. We no longer have time to keep our heads down. Not now, not ever again. Listen to and learn from Black voices. Donate your time and your money to Black-led organizations and Black causes. Learn and vote in your federal and local elections. And hey, Bollywood, we don't want to hear any of this Black Lives Matter stuff from you unless you're also dealing with the casteism, colorism, sexism, Hindu supremacy, and support of state-sanctioned violence that's running around freely in your own industry right now. Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
All right. So again, notice your reactions and feelings to that one. On a personal note, that one hits me, and I know that I can imagine it elicits different responses from people. But we're doing what we usually do in this space, creating courageous conversation, exploring ideas that impact culture, seeing how that impacts partnerships across insiders and outsiders, and seeing where some of our unconscious bias may lie. So we appreciate the leaning in that's been going on today. We're going to end with two things. We're going to drop, I hope in the QA or in the chat, we're going to drop a couple examples of class privilege. I think we're working on that. And the last slide we want to hold up is the pyramid slide, one last way to think about this conversation, if you will, today.
Can I just quickly, because you said we're going to put some examples of class privilege, and just to say that thinking about privilege is the thing that we don't have to navigate that others may have to, more than necessarily something that is handed to us, right? So thinking about privilege is the things that we may not have to navigate that others do. So I just wanted to throw that out there for people who may not be thinking about it in the same way that we were thinking about it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And last but not least, sometimes when we hear about class or caste or climbing the social ladder, we're presented with the triangle. And and there's different classes of people. Maybe people that experience poverty are on the bottom. Maybe people that have more resources are near the top of that pyramid. That's one way we sometimes think about society, and we think about climbing up the social continuum. We also sometimes look at our organizational matrix like that. Slightly different, but the pyramid model nonetheless, where we have a point person on top of the hierarchy, and we have the foundation of the hierarchy at the bottom, if you will. I'm not even passing judgment on that. I'm just observing that. However, what I think began to happen in our conversation today, and what the work of creating inclusion and courageous conversation is about, is we kind of inverted that pyramid a little today. We asked people to start by thinking about themselves first and their self-awareness of your own class experience by listening to some of our words. Then we asked you to kind of look out into a wide continuum of culture and humanity and people and rearrange different patterns in almost like a kaleidoscope fashion to see what was coming up for you when it comes to inclusion and it comes to the idea of class and caste. Ultimately, the aim here, and this is probably a little bit of a metaphor, is to look out fast and wide. And instead of seeing one person at the top, see a continuum of partnership possibility and see a continuum of innovation possibility by looking at the triangle starting from yourself first and then out into society. Amalia, any last words from you as we prepare to close out?
No, just this concept of remembering that our personal truth is not a universal truth for all. And the key for me to enhancing my leadership in this arena especially is to be curious, to look for patterns and then get curious as to why those patterns exist, and see how much I can learn, especially when some of the things I learn may contradict with my own personal experience. How do I make room for that? And so that's the thing that I always take away from these kinds of conversations.
Thank you, everyone, for your time, investment. Anita, Keith, thank you for being our colleagues. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your personal courage today. Amalia, thank you for being a mentor to me in this work, and appreciate our production team working behind the scenes to make sure we were able to have this conversation. Most of all, we appreciate 76 of you still hanging in and all 122 of you that joined the conversation. On behalf of FDP Global, thank you for your time today.